22nd of May 2020, the Chinese government disclosed information on their latest annual defense spending for the current year. The sum of 1.268 trillion yuan was disclosed, which is equivalent to 178 billion US dollars in nominal dollar value. Comparing that sum with the previous year's figure, an increase of 6.6% is evident. But figures without context are meaningless. The thing is, there is no international standard for reporting defense budgets. Any country can report what it wants, so direct comparisons are unwise unless some deeper analysis is attempted. Unlike the US defense spending, which is reported by the US government with a fair amount of detail, but does tend to vary in the news depending on which editions are reported, the Chinese spending is devoid of details. There's just one figure. There is, however, some other official data. Chinese defense white papers have over the years given the figures of the split of those one-line defense spending sums, and added spending on personnel, maintenance and operations and equipment. Those percentages have shifted in recent years, from roughly 1/3 of the budget going to each to some 40% going to equipment and the other two getting roughly 30% each. US DoD reports on Chinese military regularly state research and development and foreign weapons purchases are not included in the Chinese figure. Back in 2012, the US DoD estimated the actual Chinese defense spending to be between 15 and 70% higher than what was reported. But comparing what we know about the US budget could help us make an estimate ourselves. The US defense budget shows that the US military personnel costs make up little under 22% of overall costs. Operations and maintenance make up the biggest part at 40%. Procurement of equipment is valued at 21%. The US also spends little under 14% on paying for research, which is not mentioned in the Chinese case, but research is almost always tied with actual equipment in the end. Certainly, if one looks at the pace of new ships, planes, missiles, etc. being inducted in Chinese service, as well as a myriad of parallel research programs which don't really lag numbers-wise behind US programs, then it does seem plausible the research money is indeed not part of the official figure, as US DoD reports suggest. But how big is the research item? At a minimum, it's probably the same as US one, 14%, but it could be somewhat bigger. Suffice to say, they're placing a lot of new systems in use, so a lot of research money is needed as well. So while it's unlikely there's something like 30% of total spending going to research, it's possible China is spending more on research percentage-wise than the US. Finally, as US DoD suggests, foreign weapons purchases are funded outside the official Chinese budgets. Today, China makes pretty much all of its military hardware itself. It buys some Russian engines, but the overall volume of business has dropped to perhaps a few billion dollars per year, meaning perhaps 1% of the entire defense spending goes to that. There is also stuff like pensions and health insurance, which is unclear to which degree it's part of the official Chinese budget. But some Western sources do claim those are not included in the Chinese budget and offer their estimate of roughly 9% to be added for that purpose over the official defense budget. The US does spend 22% on its personnel, while China spends some 30%. True, the US pays its soldiers more, as all are professional soldiers, while a fair share of Chinese soldiers are volunteer conscripts, which just get some pocket money. Chinese military probably uses a better part of the 500,000 conscript pool which is shared with their People's Armed Police paramilitary service. So something between 10 to 20% of the PLA's 2 million strong force may not require much in terms of salaries. The US, on the other hand, pays full salaries for their little under 1.4 million active personnel. It becomes apparent that the actual defense budget, which could be directly compared with the US one, is roughly 20 to 50% bigger than the announced budget. Is then the new Chinese defense spending a sign that China will overtake the US defense spending-wise anytime soon? At between $216 and $261 billion, it doesn't look like it. But $1 will not buy the same amount of equipment, same research, nor the same piece of salary in China as it will in the US. Due to smaller costs of living, prices in China are lower, salaries are lower, and overall, the Chinese budget needs a multiplier figure to be really and truly comparable to the US budget. Which brings us to the final estimate. Given the previous range, now the range gets even wider, but it's the best one can hope for in terms of accuracy. The final estimate is thus between $325 billion and $522 billion, when aiming for a truly apples-to-apples comparison. That's between 52 and 83% of the US budget, when US overseas deployments and war operation costs are excluded, as China barely does any of those. That may seem as if the US has not much to worry over yet, but there is another piece of the puzzle not mentioned yet, which possibly does worry the US government. Chinese defense spending is a fairly small part of its economy. Nominally, China claims it's around 1.2% of its GDP, but with all the additions explained in this video, it's likely to be between 1.4 and 1.7%. The US spends 3.1% of its GDP on defense. That's roughly 2 times more than China, so China has more room to grow, and the ratio becomes even slightly worse when US veterans' benefits are added. Veterans Affairs do command a sizable chunk of sort of defense-related spending, but they are an issue for US spending as they have ballooned in recent years. Their budget was just $45 billion in 2001, and it grew by a factor of 5 in 19 years, as both the veterans themselves and their families receive the benefits. There's a bunch more of various spending that this video won't go into, like intelligence agencies and whatnot, but it's likely US defense-related spending as percentage of GDP is already not 2 but closer to 3 times bigger. There's just not the same amount of economy left to go around, pumped into the military, compared to China. The coronavirus will impact both economies, but it's not looking likely the US will come out of that crisis in a better shape. The trade war between the US and China may hurt China a bit more. But again, overall, the future does seem to favor Chinese military spending more. When a world war approached, countries hiked up their spending within a year or two to massive levels. If China and the US go to war, that might happen again, and the US might actually find itself outspent. Of course, spending is one thing and actual capability is another. Capability needs technology, training, and a few decades of comparable effort to really set in. But you can learn more about that difference between the US and China from our other videos. Thanks for watching. If you liked my video, subscribe to my channel. If you want to receive notifications from YouTube about new videos released, you have to click that bell button. If you're using a mobile device, you'll get this prompt. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.